There were different languages, but that didn't influence me. Actually, two languages. My parents' native language was Yiddish, but they never let us hear a word, so it was only a secret language. You picked up what your parents didn't want you to hear, you know. But I grew up with English, of course, and with Hebrew as a second language. My relatives was the same, but they were assimilated, so spoke English. Most, not my grandparents, but the newsstand. It was a very lively culture. These were mostly unemployed working class in those days. It's 1930s, but the working class culture was quite rich and lively in those days. So the discussions would be around the dinner table. You know, latest concert of the Budapest String Quartet, performance of Shakespeare, free performance under New Deal regulations, every political topic you could think about, a very lively political atmosphere, differences between Freud and Steckel. My uncle in particular went on, in fact, to become a lay analyst. He'd never gotten beyond fourth grade, but that was not so unusual. In fact, if you even go back farther, in the 19th century, the British working classes and the American working classes were part of high culture. They read an artisan in Boston, for say a blacksmith in Boston. If he had some extra money, would hire a boy to read to him from what was then, what is now classics, then contemporary literature, and or a young woman in the farms would be reading Jane Austen, things like that, and classics as well. And the British working class is the same. A lot of that has. There were also workers' education programs. A lot of it came through the unions. A lot of that has died out, unfortunately. But it was something pretty deeply rooted in the working classes from the days of an agricultural economy right to the industrial system. So I was part of that, you know, as a child. A Hebrew teacher, but also a Hebrew scholar. And when I was maybe 10 years old or so, I read the draft of his doctoral dissertation on medieval Hebrew grammar and historical Semitic linguistics, and I was much interested in that. Later, it sort of kind of converged with work that I began to do when I got to college without any direct connection. I don't think there's something to the idea that if you use a word very frequently, it'll begin to take on all kinds of connotations and so on. But I think there's a deeper issue. These words, like, say, democracy, and in fact just about every word that's used in political discourse, tend to have dual meanings. On the one hand, there's their literal meaning. On the other hand, there's the meaning that is used for what amounts to political warfare, propaganda, indoctrination, and so on. So take democracy. If you think about the meaning of the word, a country is democratic. There are many dimensions to democracy, but one of them certainly is that public opinion is reflected to some extent in public policy. To the extent that that's true, the country is more democratic. But that is certainly not the operative sense of the term democracy. So, for example, the United States is hailed as a leading democracy, but there's always a significant gap between public opinion and policy, and now it's a total chasm. We could run through the details, but public policy is almost divorced from public opinion. And the reasons for that have to do with the mechanisms by which the nature of the government is determined and the constraints in which it functions, which reflect very substantially the distribution of power inside the society. So there's a very high concentration of economic power, and that feeds directly to political decision-making by all sorts of means, and it tends to drive policy towards the interests of the very rich and not those of the vast majority. And you see it, I mean, it's right on the front pages every day. So, for example, there's a deficit. Obama had a deficit commission. He didn't have a jobs commission. For the public, the major economic problem we face is joblessness. For the financial institutions, the major problem is the deficit. So therefore, within the Beltway, the focus is on the deficit. A couple of side comments on jobs here and there, which are very misleading. Exact opposite of what the public wants. If you take a look at the deficit, which for the public, rightly, I think, is a minor problem, the public has opinions on how to deal with the deficit, namely increase taxation on the very rich to the level where it was when we had a fast-growing economy, and preserve benefits, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. Policy is almost the exact opposite. If you take a look, say, at the Republican budget, it just came out a couple days ago. Paul Ryan's budget just agreed on by the House yesterday. That's virtually the opposite of what the public wants. The Democrats also, to some extent, not to that extreme extent. And this shows up on issue after issue. Also shows up abroad. So, for example, what you read about American foreign policy is that it's dedicated to bringing democracy everywhere. What the press sometimes calls our yearning for democracy. You take a look at policy, and it's quite different. In fact, there are extensive studies, scholarly studies by very mainstream, in fact, rather conservative authors. The main scholar who works on this topic, most respected scholarship, is by a man named Thomas Carruthers, who describes himself as a neo-Reaganite. He was in Reagan's State Department working on democracy promotion issues, so he's not giving a radical critique by any means. But he's a good scholar, and what he points out is basically that the U.S. supports democracy if and only if it accords with economic and political and strategic objectives. So the U.S. was very much in favor of democracy in Eastern Europe, because that undermined a major enemy, but it's opposed to democracy in Latin America, where we run it. And he shows that it's much more nuanced. For example, during the Reagan years, the U.S. Opposed the democratic movements in South America. There was progress in democracy in South America, where the U.S. had little influence, and it was opposed by the Reagan administration. Nearby, where the U.S. was enormous influence, there was much less progress for democracy corresponding to U.S. influence. And he points out that the U.S. was willing to support democracy just in case power remained in the hands of traditional elites with which the U.S. had long-standing connections. His conclusion from this is that presidents are all schizophrenic, but there's a different interpretation, pretty obviously. Well, and in fact, if you look case by case, you see it all the time. His own studies go into the Bush administration, but it goes way back, as far back as you want to go. Well, that's two notions of democracy. And in fact, if you go back to the Constitution, the two notions are there. So in the Constitutional Convention, James Madison, who's the main framer, he discussed this seriously. He pointed out that there's a fundamental flaw with democracy, which we have to overcome. The flaw is, he gave England as his example. That, of course, was their model. He said, suppose in England everyone could vote, real democracy. Well, in that case, the poor would use their voting power, they're the overwhelming majority, to encroach on the property of the rich. They would carry out the kinds of things that we now call land reform. And he said that would obviously be unjust, because one of the main goals of government is to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. So we therefore have to structure the system so that there won't be much democracy. And if you look at the way the constitutional system was designed, that's the way it was. So power, as Madison put it, was to be in the hands of the wealth of the nation. The Senate, which was the dominant group at the time, and wasn't elected, of course. It was the most remote from a population. The executive at that time was not an imperial president. It was mostly an administrator. So power would be in the hands of the wealthy, the wealth of the nation, the more responsible set of men, those who have sympathy for property owners and their rights, virtual paraphrase, and the public would be marginalized in various ways. A lot of discussion of this. Interestingly, Madison raised the same problem that was discussed in the first major political science study. It wasn't called political science yet. Aristotle. Aristotle's Politics is the first major extensive book on different forms of political organization. And Aristotle discussed oligarchy and kings and so on, and decided that of all the systems, democracy was probably the best. Didn't love it that much, but he said it's better than the others. But he pointed out the same problem. He was talking about Athens, not about a country. But he said in Athens, if everyone had the vote, the majority of the poor would use their voting power to take property away from the rich. And he also felt that that was unjust. And he provided a solution, but it's the opposite of Madison's. Aristotle's solution was to reduce inequality. So then the problem wouldn't arise. And he proposed what we would now call welfare state measures, common meals, things like that. Madison's solution was reduced democracy. And that's the way our own system developed. Of course, there have been centuries of struggle over this. For example, the original constitutional system, if you read the Fifth Amendment, for example, it says that no person shall be deprived of rights without due process of the law. But the Founding Fathers didn't mean person when they said person. So it obviously didn't include Native Americans. They'd do anything you like to them. It didn't include slaves. It didn't include women. And up until the mid-20th century, women were mostly property under the law. In fact, until the 1970s, women didn't even have a guaranteed legal right to serve on juries. A woman was the property of her father or her husband. So they weren't persons. And this goes right up to the present. So if you come up to the present day, take a look at Supreme Court rulings, the concept person has been both expanded and narrowed. It's been expanded to include legal fictions, corporations, collectivist legal fictions established by the government, they're persons. But it excludes undocumented immigrants. They're not persons. So they don't have rights under the laws. Well, it could go on and on. In fact, nevertheless, when we talk about, our yearning for democracy, our leading the world to democracy, none of these questions ever come up. In fact, they're not even discussed. We don't even discuss them in college, But and that's typical of political vocabulary, term after term. I think that's a much more fundamental issue than the fact that when terms are overused, they tend to lose any precise meaning. You can start in kindergarten. In fact, there's This is Wilhelm von Humboldt, who's one of the founders of classical liberalism and also the founder of the modern higher education system, university system. A very significant figure. So it happens that in the last couple of months, the journal Science, the journal of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, weekly science journal, has had a series of editorials on exactly this question, and they're quite interesting. Of course, they're concentrating mostly on higher education, but they talk. It's the editor who wrote the editorials goes down to kindergarten, and he deplores the fact that science education is shaped in a way which undermines the interests of the students, their creativity, that doesn't let them understand the joy of science. They memorize. So a sixth grader can memorize the periodic table. I can in fact remember the top line of the periodic table. Didn't mean anything, but so you memorize this thing, you pass the test, and so on. He says at the university level, students are taught to memorize a group of enzymes that does something or other. And he says that's not the way to understand anything. It has to be. He didn't bring up Humboldt, but it's essentially the way that Humboldt described at higher education in the sciences should allow students to enter into the domain in which you experience the joy of discovery. In fact, at a university like this, MIT, that's exactly the way the sciences are taught. It's not taught to test, and it doesn't really matter much what you cover. You have to sometimes say it doesn't matter what we cover, it matters what you discover. So students have to are expected to challenge, to inquire, to create. I mean, there's a framework. That's the string that von Humboldt was talking about. So yes, there's a framework, but then you encourage discovery along the way. Actually, the same series of editorials, the editor, Bruce Alberts, biochemist, talks about K to 12, younger education, same kind of criticisms. And he also points out success stories. So one of them, for example, is in kindergarten. It's a good example of this. It's a project in which the children in the kindergarten were, each child was given a small dish, and on the dish there was a collection of seeds, pebbles, and shells. And the task was to figure out which ones are the seeds. So the project started with the kids getting together and having what they called a scientific conference, in which they thought about different ways in which they might be able to do this. And then they tried out some of the ways, the teacher gives some guidance and so on, but basically the kids explored their own ideas about how to do it. By the end, they finally figured out which were the seeds and knew how to find them. At that point, every child got a magnifying glass, and the seeds, which they now knew, were cut apart, and they could find within it the embryo that makes it grow, that makes it a seed. Well, those kids, first of all, they learned about science, but they also learned what it means to discover, to create. They experienced the joy of discovery. That's serious teaching, and that can go on at any level. I mean, a friend of mine who's a sixth grade teacher, just to give one more example, she was teaching the history course, got to the American Revolution. So what she decided to do for a couple of weeks was to impose arbitrary, onerous restrictions on the children, senseless ones. And they didn't like it much, but they sort of followed them. And finally they got so upset that they were practically revolted. At that point she introduced the American Revolution. Said, yeah, that's what happened. And that's a creative way to teach history. And you can do it at any level, whether it's graduate school or kindergarten. It's the opposite of what is done. It's the opposite of No Child Left Behind, Race to the Top, teaching to test, evaluating students and teachers. In fact, I'm sure you have too, but I've seen the results of this. So I saw it with my own grandchildren, and we've all experienced it. I mean, I should say this Humboldtian conception was counterposed to a different one in the Enlightenment. The alternative conception to be rejected was thinking of education as pouring water into a vessel. And as we all know from experience, it's a pretty leaky vessel. It could be poured in, you pass the test, a week later you forgot what the subject was. Well, that's a lot of what's done, unfortunately. It's training for conformity and obedience, but not for independence of mind, meaningful participation in a free community, inquiry and investigation, and so on. And that goes right back to the origins of the mass education system. One of the great achievements of the United States was to pioneer mass public education. There wasn't any in Europe. It was elite education, or just kind of what amounted to training to be a worker. And the American system went beyond that in interesting ways, but with constraints. A large part of the motive of the educational system, the early educational system, was to convert independent farmers to docile workers in industrial system. And they resented it bitterly. The labor press, which was quite lively in the late 19th century, discusses this at length. I mean, in fact, even some of the leading intellectuals discussed it. Ralph Waldo Emerson, for example, he discussed at one point, he said he was a little surprised to see that leading political figures were so much in favor of education. And then he said, well, the reason that they give is that we have to educate. He said that there are millions of voters out there, and we have to educate them to keep them from our throats. It's back to Madison's point. If they're free and independent, they're going to go after our throats. So we have to educate them, but of course in the right way. Educate them to be conformist, obedient, not too inquisitive, just kind of accept what we impose on them. And those conflicts run right through the whole history of education up to this moment. I mean, there is technology that helps. So, for example, say when in the 1960s, if you were organizing a demonstration, you couldn't do it on the internet with social media, Twitter and so on and so forth. You could do it. In fact, it was done pretty effectively, but it was person to person, which has its advantages. Now there's technology which allows you to do it in other ways. So, for example, the Egyptian demonstrations, Tahrir Square, or Occupy in the United States. These are there's extensive use of the contemporary communication systems, so-called social media, which is good. It's helpful. On the other hand, it has its drawbacks too. It, to some extent, reduces face-to-face communication and interaction, which is really irreplaceable. There's something very different about talking to a person face-to-face and sending a Twitter to them. And so I think there's, one obvious difference is superficiality. There's only so much you can say in whatever it is, 180 characters. The other is we're human beings. We're not robots. There's just a difference in looking at somebody and talking to them, sensing their reactions intuitively, reflexively, and reacting in your own way. It's just different from email. Pretty much the simple virtues: hard work, open mind, willingness to challenge received opinion, not just for the sake of challenging, but in order to understand it or improve it or reject it. And The main thing is just hard, dedicated work and a critical mind. I don't think there's any special techniques, none that I know. And a good educational system should cultivate that. Well, I don't, though a lot of my life is devoted to direct activism, I don't think the academic institution, as an institution, should take a position on the issues of the day, the issues that an activist would be committed to. I think it should give plenty of opportunity for it, allow people to do it freely, independently, encourage that. But the institution itself, I think, should be neutral, not on everything. So take, say, MIT, some special case maybe, but interesting one. This is an institution mainly oriented towards science and technology. Back 40 or 50 years ago, it was mostly an engineering school. It's shifted to be from engineering to science as engineering and science have changed. So 50 years ago when I got here, students would learn a particular engineering discipline, say mechanical engineering. But over the years, really for the first time in history, science, fundamental science, has had a lot to tell engineering practice and medical practice and so on. And the technology changes much more rapidly. So students now just fundamentally learn basic science and mathematics, and to prepare them for the ways in which technology will develop and change. There's no point learning the technology of today if it's going to be different 10 years from now. Same with medicine. That raises some very significant. Also, this is an institute. Technically, it's a private university, but in fact, in the 50s and the 60s, it was probably 90% funded by the Pentagon. And a lot of questions arise about the uses to which science and technology are put. Interestingly, those questions were not raised in the 50s and the 60s. But by the late 1960s, under the pressure of the growing student movements and the young activists, these questions moved to the center of the agenda. By 1969, it was very significant. There was, in fact, even a day called off by the administration for just discussion of the social uses of technology and their consequences. And that's all had big effects. So on the culture of the institution. And those are things that make sense. Like you should, an institution like this should be asking itself whether, say, military work should be permitted on campus, or classified work. What are the consequences of what you do? They're enormous. You should think about them. So what are the effects on the environment, on the nuclear weapons, on all sorts of things? So now that's a central part of kind of the general culture of the Institute and permeates the classes, curricula, and so on. On the other hand, taking a position on, say, should we invade Iraq, I don't think that's the proper role for a university. For people within it, sure, and every opportunity should be available to debate it, discuss it, have demonstrations, activism, and so on. But the basic role of the institution, I think, should be just what we were talking about before, to try to cultivate and encourage independent minds, independent, challenging, creative minds. Then people do where their goals and commitments lead them. Well, there's, I think, two basic answers to that. One is empirical, one's logical. The empirical answer is just take a look at what's happened in the past. I mean, all sorts of awful things in the world, but we live in a much more civilized world than not very long ago. So in fact, take some of the things I just mentioned before. For example, rights of women. It's just changed enormously in my lifetime, enormously. I mean, for example, my grandmother, if somebody told her she was oppressed, she wouldn't even know what they're talking about. Because that's just life, you know. My mother knew about it and resented it, but accepted it. And my daughters don't accept it at all. Well, those are changes. And it's not my family, it's everywhere. And how did that happen? Well, it happened thanks to the work of people who didn't give up, who didn't assume that the structures of oppression and domination are permanent. They're not laws of nature. They should be challenged. And if they're not legitimate, should be overcome. And that's happened in domain after domain. You know, elimination of slavery, getting rid of feudalism, kings, and so on. So there's good empirical reasons to think that there's a lot that you can do. The kind of logical reason is that you basically have two choices. One choice is to say, it's hopeless, nothing can be done, therefore I'm not going to try, and therefore I'll help ensure that the worst will happen. The other choice is to say, maybe there's a chance, I'll devote myself to trying to overcome pathologies of the society, discrimination, repression, and so on, and then maybe things will be better later on. Well, those are your two choices. We can't really know, you know, we don't understand enough to predict, but given those two choices, there's no real option as to which one you take. So that's a reason to be hopeful, because otherwise you're just guaranteeing that the worst will happen.